In the early weeks of September 1994, the air in rural Idaho carried that unmistakable edge of approaching autumn. Mornings came crisp and cool, the sort that made you see your own breath, and the trees along the highways had begun their slow transformation into reds, golds, and deep amber. For Robert and Ellen Bennett, it felt like the perfect time to escape the routines of work and school for a couple of days at their cabin tucked deep in the woods near Lake Thornberry. With the help of their children, 9-year-old Jason and 6-year-old Katie, they packed grocery bags, extra blankets, and a cooler into their aging station wagon, planning what was supposed to be a peaceful weekend far from the noise of town. It was meant to be a simple trip, nothing unusual for the family, but by Monday morning they had vanished without a trace. What should have been a short getaway instead became the beginning of a mystery that would haunt their community for decades. When neighbors first checked the Bennett home, the scene was strange. The front door was locked, the station wagon gone, yet the inside was frozen in a moment that seemed to promise their return. Beds were made neatly. Plates rested in a drying rack beside the sink. Ellen's well-worn blue jacket still hung by the front door, the same one she wore year-round. It all suggested they planned to come back. Search teams quickly mobilized, scouring the winding roads between town and the cabin. Those roads twisted through forests, along riverbanks, and over steep ridges where a single mistake could send a car plummeting into thick undergrowth. But no matter how many miles they covered, there was no sign of the Bennetts, no crash, no abandoned vehicle, no evidence of distress. It was as though they had been erased from the map. For the next 10 years, the case sat dormant, gathering dust in the precinct archives. Then, in 2004, a slow afternoon audit of old evidence led to a discovery that would change everything. A young officer, sorting through mislabeled boxes, opened one with nothing but Bennett scrawled in faded Sharpie. Inside, tucked beside a broken keychain and a Ziploc bag of toy blocks, was a yellow Kodak disposable camera collected from the Bennett home in 1994, and never developed. When the photographs were finally processed, one image captured inside the Bennett house caused a seasoned detective to physically step back from the table. It showed someone who shouldn't have been there. Back in 1994, the disappearance hadn't immediately set off alarm bells. Idaho was a state of open land and endless back roads. People could vanish, sometimes on purpose, sometimes by accident, into its wild spaces. But the Bennetts were not drifters. They were rooted. Robert was steady, a man defined by routine. As a mechanical engineer at the local power plant, he was known for precision and reliability, paying the mortgage early, rotating his own tires, trimming the lawn to perfection. Ellen was gentle and quietly attentive, working part-time as a teacher's aide. She was the kind of person who remembered the birthdays of children she'd taught years earlier. Jason was bright, restless, and often fiddling with small gadgets or his handheld camcorder. Katie, with her quiet imagination, never went anywhere without a faded pink rabbit tucked under her arm. The family lived in a 2-story house on the edge of town, complete with vinyl siding, plastic wind chimes on the porch, and a swing set in the backyard that squeaked when the wind blew. On the surface, they were the embodiment of small-town normalcy. The Friday they left, neighbors saw Robert packing the wagon with groceries, a cooler, and a sleeping bag lashed to the roof rack. Jason filmed bits of the process with his camcorder, its red light blinking. Katie clutched her rabbit, her purple sweater sleeves pulled down over her hands. The family waved as they drove off toward Lake Thornberry, a trip they had made dozens of times before. By Monday morning, silence. Ellen never called her sister to say they'd returned, a ritual she never skipped. Robert failed to show up at the power plant without calling, something co-workers said had never happened in his 15 years there. By Tuesday, police were involved. Inside the house, nothing looked disturbed. Mail was stacked neatly by the door. Coffee mugs had been rinsed and placed upside down in the sink. On Ellen's calendar, the weekend was marked in blue ink, CABIN. But Daisy, their golden retriever, had been left behind without food or water. Friends swore they had never once gone on a trip without arranging care for the dog. The search spread quickly. Helicopters swept over roads and forest clearings. Divers plunged into the cold waters of the lake. Rangers combed trails and logging roads. The cabin was found just as meticulously kept as their home. Groceries in the fridge, clothing in drawers, beds turned down as if for the night. But there was no sign of the Bennetts, and their station wagon was missing. No tire tracks, no witnesses, no receipts or sightings in nearby towns. It was as though the weekend had been wiped clean from existence. Investigators found no signs of trouble in the Bennetts' history. No debts, no criminal records, no custody disputes. Bank statements showed no unusual withdrawals. Storage units hadn't been rented. There was no evidence they'd planned to leave their lives behind. 2 weeks later, the story faded from local headlines. 2 months later, the case stalled. A year later, it was little more than a lingering question. Detective Avery Cole, who'd worked the case from the start, never fully let go of it. Even after it went cold, the folder sat on his desk longer than most. He often reread a particular report from a ranger who'd searched the cabin. In the cabin's fireplace, the ranger had found a logbook, only partially burned. 3 lines had been written inside. In Ellen's hand. Didn't sleep. He walked again. Don't wake the kids. At the time, the words were brushed aside. An old cabin creaked and groaned. Animals prowled outside at night. Maybe Ellen had been noting Robert's restlessness, but to Cole, don't wake the kids, felt unsettling. It stuck with him. Cole retired in 2001 without answers. In 2004, Officer Marissa Duval was clearing shelves in the evidence warehouse when she reached for a box labeled only with the Bennett name. No case number, no paperwork. Inside, along with a jumble of forgotten items, was that undeveloped yellow camera. She almost tossed it into the backlog bin until she read the name again. That hesitation would prove fateful. Marissa remembered the story immediately. Anyone who'd grown up in Idaho Falls did. It wasn't just another cold case. It was a part of the town's collective memory, a quiet shadow that never quite left. So instead of tossing the forgotten camera into a box to collect more dust, she drove it to the only photo lab still operating in town. The place was a narrow, fluorescent-lit shop tucked between a hardware store and a laundromat, the sort of business that had survived mostly on wedding prints, school portraits, and people who still hadn't gone digital. 3 days later, she returned, still in uniform, and walked out to her car with a yellow envelope in hand. She didn't even wait to leave the parking lot before peeling the flap open. The first few prints were what you'd expect from a family on a weekend getaway. Robert flipping burgers over a small charcoal grill, Ellen leaning down to brush Katie's hair by the cabin steps, Jason pulling a ridiculous face at the camera, mid-laugh. Then came shots of the cabin's interior. The fireplace, a staircase draped with a worn quilt, a half-played board game waiting on the dining table. Harmless, ordinary. But as she thumbed through, one photo made her pause. The last frame was different. Darker, blurred slightly at the edges, the kind of photo you get when the camera shakes just enough to smudge reality. The colors were flat, with low contrast. It had been taken inside, at night. The furniture in the living room pushed away from the walls as though something had been moved or made space for. And there, standing just inside the edge of the flash's weak halo, was Robert Bennett. He wasn't smiling or mid-gesture like in the other pictures. His arms hung loosely at his sides. His posture was too still, too symmetrical. It wasn't the stance of someone caught off guard or in motion. It looked more like he had been listening, waiting for something. His head angled slightly as though a sound had caught him. The camera's flash had bleached part of the scene, but Robert's face was sharp enough to see every line. No expression, no warmth. Just a flat, unreadable look that didn't match the man seen in the earlier frames. Marissa found herself staring at it for far longer than she meant to. Out of an entire roll filled with laughter, toys on the floor, and sunlight through windows, This was the only one where the life seemed drained out of the moment. She wasn't a detective, just a patrol officer working light duty, clearing storage shelves. But she had grown up with the Bennett story. Everyone her age had. It wasn't a case you forgot. A whole family gone. No goodbyes, no warning, no dramatic headlines, just gone. She slipped the photos back into the envelope, sealed them in a new evidence bag, and filled out a property tag in her neat handwriting. Her note was short. Bennett case. Undeveloped film, recovered 10 years later. The final frame is unusual. Possible subject, Robert Bennett. The bag ended up on the desk of Detective Lyle Henning. He had been barely out of the academy when the Bennetts disappeared. One of the rookies assigned to search the woods and organize divers at Lake Thornberry. He still remembered the cabin's quiet, the way the air inside felt heavier somehow, as though whatever had already happened long before anyone arrived. Henning studied the photograph for a long time. Robert's shoulders sloped forward. His head was tilted slightly, hands loose at his sides. It wasn't a threatening pose, but it was wrong. In every other shot, Robert was easy to spot. Talking, laughing, gesturing, interacting. Here, he was distant, disconnected, like someone who had already stepped out of his own life. Henning sent the print to forensics for a high-resolution scan. The lab adjusted the contrast, balanced the light, and magnified it pixel by pixel. No shapes in the shadows. No reflection of another figure in the window glass. Nothing in the background that shouldn't be there. But there was one anomaly. A digital timestamp. 3:14 a.m. None of the other photos had timestamps. The roll was from a cheap disposable camera, and metadata on film like that was notoriously unreliable. Still, that one frame was different. It placed Robert in the cabin's living room in the middle of the night, hours after everyone should have been asleep. And if Robert had been the one holding the camera, why take a picture of an empty room? Henning requested the original case file from the archives. The stack was thick. Hundreds of pages of statements, photographs, and maps. One early interview stood out. Mrs. Calhoun, the Bennett's neighbor across the street, told officers that on the night before the trip, Robert had knocked on her door. He'd asked her to collect their mail for the next 2 days. Normal enough. But then he added something she'd never forgotten. If anyone asks, tell them you saw us leave. At the time, it was written off as an awkward joke. But 10 years later, Henning read it with fresh eyes. Why are people asking about their departure unless you expected them to? Henning dug deeper. Robert's work records showed nothing alarming. No disciplinary actions, no missed shifts. Colleagues described him as quiet but dependable. Precise with numbers, not prone to chatter. Then Henning found a note in HR records. 6 months before the disappearance, Robert had requested 2 weeks vacation for an out-of-state family trip. Payroll confirmed it had been approved, but Robert never took it. No one at work saw him leave, and no one in the family mentioned travel. He canceled the request last minute, offering no explanation. It wasn't a crime. But when added to the strange late-night photograph and the neighbor's uneasy recollection, it began to feel heavier. Henning decided to see the cabin for himself. The property had reverted to state ownership years ago when the taxes went unpaid. The building, now a skeleton of its former self, leaned slightly to one side. The roof sagged, and the paint had long since peeled away. He didn't call for backup, didn't log his visit. He just drove. The woods around the cabin were silent except for the crunch of leaves underfoot. The door was still intact, though the lock had rusted. When he stepped inside, the smell met him instantly. Aged timber, dust, and the faint scent of mildew. Everything was as if frozen in time. The breakfast nook with its bench seating, the narrow bunk beds, the empty bookshelf. Then his flashlight swept the far corner of the main room, and he froze. Something there didn't match the photographs from 1994. It wasn't furniture. It wasn't anything that should have been there at all. The corner looked wrong, as though the wall itself had shifted inward. Henning stepped closer, the beam of his flashlight quivering slightly as his grip tightened. What he saw wasn't damage from weather or rot. It was a dark, rectangular space, almost perfectly cut, hidden behind a panel of warped wood. The edges were lined with a dust so undisturbed it made him certain no one had touched it in years. Kneeling, he brushed away debris and saw the faint outline of a hinge. A door, barely wide enough for a person to slip through. The smell from inside was different, stale in a way that made the air feel thick. He didn't go in. Not yet. Instead, he stood there, the beam of light vanishing into blackness, and wondered how something like this had never been mentioned in the original reports. The cabin had been searched. Every wall, every floorboard, every inch of the property had supposedly been catalogued. But this hidden space, wasn't in the file. And standing in that silent room, Henning felt the weight of the photo back at the station. Robert Bennett, awake at 3:14 a.m., standing in this very cabin, looking not at the camera, but at something or someone just beyond its edge. The first thing Henning noticed in the far corner was that the floor wasn't quite right. The grain of the wood shifted direction, the boards meeting at sharper angles than they should. When he swept his flashlight lower, the beam caught the faint outline of a square, about 2 feet across, cut neatly into the planks. A trap door, flush with the rest of the floor. It had never been mentioned in any of the original reports. Curiosity prickled in his gut. He dropped to one knee and flipped through the black and white photos from the 1994 scene. In every picture, the floor was bare and unbroken. No seams, no hatch. Either it had been added in the years since, or it had been overlooked completely. Neither option sat well with him. He wedged a screwdriver under the edge. The wood resisted at first, then gave way with a long, aching creak that echoed in the small cabin. Beneath it yawned a shallow crawl space, barely 3 feet deep, lined with hard-packed dirt. For a moment, it appeared empty, until his light skimmed over a corner near the far wall, where something lay half-buried in loose soil. A stack of flattened cardboard boxes. He climbed down carefully, the air instantly cooler and damp against his skin. Kneeling, he brushed away the dirt. 3 boxes. 2 were hollow and caved in from years of weight. The third was intact, and across its side, in black marker, was a line of block letters. Katie's things. Keep safe. His throat tightened. He slid it toward him, opened the flaps. Inside were small, ordinary artifacts of a child's world. Thin-spined picture books with worn covers, a pink stuffed rabbit with one ear flopped permanently sideways, a folder of paper crammed with drawings, crayon-scrawled notes, and school handouts. One drawing stopped him cold. 4 stick figures, hand in hand, standing in front of a rough outline of the cabin. But the smallest figure, the one farthest to the right, had been scribbled over in thick, deliberate red crayon. Not erased, not hastily crossed out. Covered again and again, until the paper fibers beneath had begun to wear. Henning stared at it for a long moment, the smell of earth heavy in his nostrils. The trapdoor above cast a gray square of light across the dirt floor, but it illuminated nothing else. No answers, just the box and that drawing that somehow felt heavier than its weight in his hands. Back in his car, he set the box on the passenger seat. He didn't start the engine right away. Instead, he sat there with the key in his hand, the autumn air leaking in through the cracked window. The physical weight of the box was nothing, but the emotional weight pressed against him in a way he couldn't shake. That image, 4 figures, one obliterated in red, lodged in his mind like a splinter. It wasn't the kind of mark a child makes in a passing fit of boredom. It was intentional, focused. The pressure of each stroke had to come from a small hand gripping the crayon tightly. That deliberateness gnawed at him. At the station, he logged the find into evidence under a simple note. Found at Bennett's cabin. Not in original inventory. The folder of drawings went aside for later analysis. Then he pulled the old witness statements from the file. Most had blurred together over the years, but one, in particular, caught his eye now. Jason Bennett's third-grade teacher, Ms. Alvarez, had told investigators that in the week before the family vanished, Jason had been unusually withdrawn. He'd come to school pale, heavy-eyed, head down on the desk, refusing recess. When she'd asked if he felt sick, he'd said something odd. He was walking again last night. At the time, she assumed he meant a neighbor, or maybe the family dog pacing the halls. But paired now with Ellen Bennett's half-burned logbook entry, he walked again. Don't wake the kids. It was no longer something he could dismiss. Henning unfolded the forensic floor plan of the Bennett home. Jason's bedroom was upstairs, back corner. Robert and Ellen's room was across the hall. The corridor between them was narrow, the kind that carried every creak and groan of the boards. If someone paced there in the middle of the night, you wouldn't just hear it. You'd feel it in your chest. The next morning, he drove to the old Bennett house. A young couple lived there now, with a toddler who peeked at him shyly from behind the couch. They agreed to let him walk through, curiosity flickering in their eyes. At the top of the stairs, he stood still, listening. The boards moaned faintly under his weight. He walked from Jason's room to Robert and Ellen's, then back again. Every step announced itself. He turned toward the hallway window, looking out over the backyard where the leaves had turned, just like they had that September weekend. For a moment, it felt as if time had looped back on itself. As he made to leave, the new homeowner mentioned something in passing. "We still get their mail sometimes," she said. "Mostly junk, but about a year ago, there was this manila envelope. No return address. Inside was just one Polaroid, trees." Henning froze mid-step. "Do you still have it?" he asked. She nodded, disappearing into the kitchen. She came back with a faded, slightly curled photograph. It showed a stand of pine trees and thick brush. No people, no obvious landmarks. Until his eyes caught the lower corner of the frame, a sliver of roofline, weathered and familiar. The cabin. He thanked her, tucking the Polaroid into a folder. At the lab, analysts studied the image. Based on foliage and the angle of sunlight, it had been taken in early spring. The paper and film stock dated it to somewhere around 1995 or 96, a year or two after the Bennetts disappeared. Why it had surfaced nearly a decade later was another question entirely. Henning had the lab compare the handwriting on the envelope to samples from the case file. Nothing matched. He asked postal records for anything similar. Same envelope type, no return address, same postage. But the trail went nowhere. Later that week, forensics called again. They had revisited the cabin photo from the recovered disposable camera, the one where Robert stood still in the living room. They'd enhanced every inch. No hidden figures, no reflections in the glass. But there was one detail they hadn't noticed before. In Robert's left hand, just below his hip, partly swallowed by shadow, was something small and metallic. Adjusting the contrast revealed its shape, a cylinder roughly the size of a disposable camera. Not the same one found at the Bennett home, which meant, if the photo showed Robert holding it, there had to be a second camera. Henning leaned back in his chair, the possibilities turning over in his mind. If Robert had been photographed holding a camera, and someone else had taken that shot, then somewhere out there was another roll of film. He ordered a property inventory search. Nothing. He extended the request to pawn shops, storage auctions, and even the state police archives for unrelated cases in the region. Still nothing. Until a week later, when the phone rang. The voice on the other end was rough, weathered with age. "Name's Lenny Briggs. I was a game warden back in the day. Heard you're asking about the Bennetts." Henning confirmed. "Well," Briggs said slowly, "years ago, I was walking the lakeside trail. Found a camera out there just lying in the brush. Never knew what to do with it. Guess I might still have it somewhere." Briggs told Henning he'd turned the camera into the ranger station years ago, but doubted anyone had ever picked it up. He remembered the timing clearly. It had been the summer of '95. The same week, a pair of kayakers came across a burned-out tent on the far side of the ridge. That detail had stuck with him for years. Scorched nylon sagging over a twisted frame, char marks blackening the ground, and no sign of the people who had once camped there. Henning made the call immediately. By some small stroke of luck, or the kind of benign neglect that preserves old secrets, the ranger station still had an unsorted cardboard box marked in thick marker. Lost and found. 1990s. Beneath a tangle of faded topographic maps, tangled fishing line, and cracked compass casings lay a yellow disposable camera. The casing was dulled from age, sticky with dust. But the film compartment was still sealed, untouched in nearly a decade. This time, Henning didn't trust the usual evidence chain. He didn't hand it to a courier. He drove it himself to the lab, signing it in under his own name. 3 days later, the prints were ready. 7 photographs in total. The first 2 were little more than blurred shapes of pine and spruce, their outlines soft and indistinct. The third showed the lake at sunset, the water flattened into molten copper under the last flare of daylight. The fourth was a close-up of a car door, handle dulled with smudges, chrome weathered. The fifth, someone's feet in worn hiking boots, toes pointed down on a dirt trail, as though the photographer had been studying their own steps. Then came the sixth. It showed the cabin porch at night. A single bulb burned above the door, casting a pale cone of light over weathered boards. The door itself hung ajar, swallowing the view into darkness. And in the lower left of the frame, barely caught before the image ended, was a boot. Scuffed leather, laced high, facing straight toward the lens, as if its wearer had stepped outside and then frozen mid-motion. Henning stared at it far longer than he intended. On its own, the picture was ordinary. Porch, door, light bulb. But the angle told a different story. Whoever had taken it wasn't standing on the porch. They were below it, near the bottom step, aiming slightly upward. And the boot was still, not moving, not retreating, just fixed there in place. The question came quickly. Had the photo been taken by one of the Bennetts, or of them? The lab scanned it for scale and proportion. The match was close. A men's size 11 hiking model, sold in the early 1990s. DMV records put Robert Bennett in size 11 footwear. It wasn't confirmation, but it was enough to narrow the possibilities. The 7th and final photograph was the most puzzling. Taken from inside the cabin, the camera's flash had blown out much of the foreground into harsh white. But shapes lingered at the edges. The leg of a table, the corner of a window frame, and on the floor, just inside the flood of light, something spiral-bound. The same style of notebook Ellen had used for the family's logbook. Henning checked the timestamp. 4:02 a.m., nearly an hour after the final image from the first camera. Someone had still been awake, still moving, still taking pictures. 2 cameras, 2 nights. 2 sets of quiet, disconnected moments that were starting to arrange themselves into something stranger. Robert, standing unmoving in the living room at 3:14 a.m. A solitary boot at the porch's edge. A notebook left on the floor before dawn. None of this had been in the original report. Henning drove back to the cabin without telling anyone. It was colder now. The trees outside stood stripped of their leaves, skeletal fingers scratching the gray sky. Wind sighed through the gaps in the warped roof, each gust sounding almost like breath. He stood in the doorway, looking down the narrow trail where that boot might have been captured. The path was uneven, strewn with loose gravel, flanked by patches of overgrown brush. It was not the sort of route you took at night unless you had a reason, unless you were searching for something or trying to leave. Inside, Henning lowered himself to a crouch near the fireplace. The ash had long since settled into a dull, lifeless gray. He swept a gloved hand across the brick lip of the hearth and felt something catch. A curled fragment of paper, blackened, wedged deep in a seam. He teased it out carefully. The page was brittle, thin as onion skin, most of it consumed by fire. Only a few words survived, written in Ellen's neat hand. Woke again. Didn't speak, just stood. I think he... The sentence ended in burned nothingness. Henning sealed it into an evidence bag, scrawling a single word on the label: fragment. Back at the station, he returned to the witness statements, focusing now on Ellen's sister, Margaret. In 1994, she had told investigators that Ellen had called the week of the trip, mentioning she was nervous about the drive. Buried deeper in the transcript was a line Henning had skimmed over before. Margaret had said Ellen sounded tired, said Robert hadn't been sleeping much, said he seemed distracted. The original interviewer hadn't pressed for more. Henning called her directly. She still lived in Spokane, answering after 3 rings. When he explained who he was, her tone tightened immediately.
"I always knew something wasn't right,"
she told him.
"but they said there was nothing to go on, that they probably got lost."
Henning asked her what she meant by wasn't right. There was a long pause before she said, "It was the way she put it." Robert's quiet again, like it had happened before. Did she ever explain what she meant? She once told me he'd wake up in the middle of the night and just stand in the hallway. Wouldn't move. Wouldn't say a word. She thought maybe it was sleepwalking, but I don't know. Henning thanked her and hung up, the words settling like dust in his mind. It wasn't proof, but it was a pattern, and it tied neatly to Jason's teacher's account, to Ellen's burned log entries, to the photographs themselves. He returned to the evidence room and retrieved the envelope from the second camera. The last image, the one with the notebook on the floor, had been bothering him since he'd first seen it. This time, he zoomed in further, and there it was. In the lower right-hand corner, almost hidden where the flash's reach gave way to shadow, was a shape. A dark curve tapering down, the faint suggestion of a head and shoulder. Not a flaw in the film, not a trick of the light. If that shape were a person, then the photographer had not been alone in that room. The shadow in the photograph was barely more than a suggestion, faint, smudged, yet with a height and density that hinted at a human figure lingering just beyond the reach of the flash. Whoever it was, they hadn't moved, simply stood there in the dark, watching. Henning ordered the image reprinted at a much larger scale. Back in his office, he pinned it to the center of his whiteboard and took several steps back, letting his eyes scan the scene. Spread across the enlarged frame were small but telling fragments. The corner of a table angled oddly, a spiral notebook lying abandoned on the floor, the edge of a window pane reflecting a ghostly glint of light, and in that upper corner, the vague, inky smear of a shape that refused to explain itself. It wasn't proof, not in any form that could hold up in court, but the photograph stirred something deep in him. The kind of gut-deep alertness that only came when the facts in front of you left too many gaps. Sometimes it wasn't what you saw that mattered. It was what you couldn't. For nearly 10 minutes, he stood there in the stillness of his office, the quiet broken only by the soft hum of the fluorescent light above. Then he reached for the original 1994 cabin inventory. The list was thorough. Cookware stacked in the kitchen, neatly folded clothing, cut firewood, clean linens. But Henning's eyes snagged on what wasn't there. There was no entry for Ellen Bennett's notebook, the very one partially visible in that final photo. If it hadn't been cataloged, it meant it wasn't in the cabin during the first police sweep. And if it wasn't there then, someone had moved it. Henning called the forensic lab. His instructions were precise. Analyze the spiral binding in the photograph, determine possible manufacturers, page size, paper tone, anything that could match it to a specific product line. 2 days later, the lab called back with a lead. The binding, page format, and stock paper matched a spiral-bound journal produced between 1992 and 1994, sold in small quantities at a now-closed stationery shop in town, Spindle's Paper and Supply. Henning tracked down the shop's old purchase records. They were handwritten in fading ink, the paper brittle with age, but the owner had kept a list of frequent customers. One name leapt out, Robert Bennett. 6 months before the disappearance, Robert had bought 2 identical notebooks. It was enough to push for a second search of the property. This time, Henning requested a metal detector and ground-penetrating radar. The DA approved. The work was slow, the November air sharp and metallic in the lungs. Frozen soil resisted each shovel. The forest around them was quiet enough that every crack of ice beneath their boots sounded louder than it should. Then, near the tree line behind the cabin, the scanner's tone changed. A muted, steady signal. 2 feet down, the tip of a shovel struck something firm. Wrapped in layers of plastic, coated in damp earth, lay a notebook. Back at the lab, they set it on an absorbent pad, peeling the plastic away carefully. The pages were waterlogged but intact. Ellen's handwriting filled the first half, tidy lines chronicling ordinary moments. What they'd eaten, the time they'd arrived, a note about Jason and Katie arguing over a board game. But as the entries approached the last pages, the tone shifted. Robert stayed up again last night. Didn't speak, just stood. I heard the car door open at 2 a.m. No one else heard it. The next day's entry read, "He says he's fine, says he's thinking about work, but there's nothing to think about. I don't think he's sleeping at all." The final page, "He told me not to wake the kids, said we'd leave in the morning. I'm writing this quietly. I don't think we're leaving." Henning's eyes fixed on the date at the top. It matched the timestamp of the final photograph, 4:03 m. down to the minute. Whoever had taken that picture had done so moments after Ellen wrote her last words. That notebook should have been found in 1994. Instead, someone had hidden it in the cold earth behind the cabin, and the list of people who could have done that in that short window of time was very small. Henning didn't speak the name. He didn't add it to the official file. Instead, he wrote a single question on a sticky note and pressed it beside the photograph. Was she trying to leave? That afternoon, he called the elementary school that the Bennett children had attended. The secretary remembered the case vividly and promised to dig their files out of storage. When Henning picked them up, something extra was clipped to Jason's file. A folded piece of paper, the edges worn from years in storage. Inside was a drawing dated the week before the family vanished. It showed 4 stick figures, much like the drawing Henning had discovered in the crawl space box at the cabin. But in this one, the smallest figure was intact. The difference was in the father figure, drawn without a face, holding a small, bright red shape in his hand. Henning angled the page under the light. The red shape could have been a flashlight, a tool, or maybe a bag. But it was the only object in the drawing colored differently from everything else. He carried it to his desk and laid it next to the enlarged photo of Robert Bennett standing in the living room at 3 a.m. The resemblance was immediate. Same stance, same angle of the arm. In the photograph, Robert's hand was wrapped around something small and indistinct, almost swallowed by shadow. But now, in light of Jason's drawing, it didn't feel meaningless. It felt deliberate. Henning leaned back, letting the wall of evidence come into focus. 2 photographs taken in the dead hours of night. A buried notebook, a child's 2 drawings, and a string of warnings in Ellen's own hand. The question was no longer whether something had happened in that cabin. The question was how much had already begun before the Bennetts ever arrived. Henning pulled the 1994 phone records from the file cabinet and began scanning line by line, looking for the next thread to pull. The Bennett landline records from 1994 weren't much to go on. Technology back then left a shallow paper trail, but the phone company had at least kept a list of outgoing calls in the days before the trip. 2 days prior to departure, Robert had made 4 of them. 1 was to his workplace, 2 went to the gas company, and the last was to a disconnected number. Henning dug deeper, pulling old archives from the phone provider. That dead number had once belonged to Greystone Supply, a hardware store that shut its doors in 1993. Locals still remembered it as the place you went for hunting gear, climbing rope, and heavy-duty tools. A name in the town's records led Henning to a former employee. The man's memory was hazy. Robert had never been much of a talker, but he did recall the engineer's visits. Always the same purchases, the man said, rope and general utility tools. Nothing against the law, but oddly consistent. Out of habit more than expectation, Henning submitted a request for any remaining Bennett credit card statements from that final month. The data was sparse, but one charge caught his eye. 5 days before the family vanished, Robert had paid Rustic Rental, a small roadside business that specialized in tow-behind utility trailers. The case file had never mentioned a trailer. No witness had ever reported seeing one hitched to the Bennett family car. Curious, Henning drove to the business, finding it still standing but under new ownership. When he asked about records, the current manager disappeared into a back office and returned with a thick binder coated in a layer of dust. And there it was, Robert Bennett's name. Next to it, the handwritten note. Rented utility box trailer, 3 days. Returned in person. No issues. The return date stopped Henning cold. 2 days after the Bennetts had already been reported missing. He read it twice. Returned in person. Flipping the page revealed one more note in the margin. No hitch needed. Customer said unloading at property. Henning closed the binder slowly. This wasn't speculation anymore. This was movement, confirmed after the supposed disappearance. Whatever had happened at the cabin, Robert had left afterward, returned a trailer, and then disappeared again without a trace. Security footage would have been the next step, but the manager laughed. "We didn't even have cameras until 2001, he said. Still, the ledger entry was enough to rewrite the timeline. Henning pinned a new slip to the board. Robert. Movement confirmed, post-disappearance. That evening, he pulled Ellen's recovered notebook from its evidence bag and reread the final full entry. He told me not to wake the kids, said we'd leave in the morning. I'm writing this quietly. I don't think we're leaving. The tone didn't read as panic. It read as resignation, as though Ellen had already come to terms with something she couldn't stop. Henning circled the one phrase that still carried a trace of hope. We'd leave in the morning. From the corner of his office, he took down a large fold-out topographic map of the Lake Thornberry area. On it, he marked the location of the cabin with a red thumbtack. A second pin marked where the family car had last been confirmed. And a third, Rustic Rental, sat nearly 2 hours away. Tracing the space between them told a story. Robert's route after the cabin wasn't toward town at all. It bent west into the old mining country. Miles of forgotten fire roads and narrow dirt tracks leading into federal forest land. The kind of place where a person could vanish without anyone knowing which way they went. Henning requested an aerial scan of the area from old survey archives. 2 days later, he had something. A grainy black and white satellite image from the spring of 1995 showed a small, square-shaped disturbance in the trees near the base of a ridge. Too small to be a cabin, too symmetrical to be random. He zoomed in until the pixels blurred. Even with the poor quality, the outline felt deliberate. That night, Henning called a contact in the local search and rescue unit. He didn't explain exactly what he was chasing, only that he needed someone capable of leading him deep into territory without trails or signs. By dawn, he and his guide, a lean man named Reed, were standing at the forest's edge. The air was cool and damp, carrying the scent of pine resin and wet soil. They carried only what they needed: water, rope, a GPS, and light packs. The way in wasn't marked. What had once been a narrow road had long since been swallowed by brush and saplings. Broken fence posts leaned at odd angles like the ribs of something long dead. Reed didn't waste words. He moved with the kind of quiet efficiency that comes from decades of reading the land. Henning followed the coordinates from the old satellite photo, each step taking them farther from the comfort of mapped ground. The forest deepened. The wind threading through the branches overhead was the only constant sound. Hours passed in steady rhythm. Boots pressing into soft earth, the occasional snap of a twig underfoot. At 11:42 a.m., Reed stopped mid-stride, eyes fixed ahead. "There," he said, pointing to a shallow depression about 50 yards away. "That's not natural." Henning's heartbeat kicked harder as they pushed forward. The clearing was smaller than he'd expected, maybe 30 feet across. At its center was a low mound of earth, its contours too regular to be a simple drift of soil. Reed dropped to one knee, brushing away the top layer of dead leaves with gloved fingers. Beneath the mulch, the packed ground was darker, almost black, as though it had been disturbed long ago. Beneath the layer of soil, the glint of corrugated steel appeared. A buried roof. Henning took a step back, exhaled sharply, and radioed it in. Coordinates were logged, and within 2 days, a quiet excavation order was in place. No press releases, no curious onlookers. Just a small forensic crew working under a pale, cold sun. What emerged from the ground wasn't a house in the traditional sense. It was a single-room shelter, the kind of makeshift hunting cabin that might have once offered a dry night to trappers or poachers decades earlier. The steel had been laid over aging timber, the walls half collapsed inward under years of weight and weather. Inside, the smell was thick, damp soil, rot, and something metallic clinging in the air. The floor crunched faintly beneath each step. Under the debris, they began to uncover things that didn't belong to the forest, things that should never have been here at all. First, a small child's shoe, worn at the heel. Then, a rusted thermos, with the initials KB scratched into the base. Katie Bennett. A dented camping lantern, same brand and model as the one listed on the Bennett family's cabin rental receipt from 1994. And in the farthest corner, beneath a tarp that had somehow stayed dry all these years, was a child-sized sleeping bag, zipped up tight around nothing. Each item was photographed, dusted, bagged, and catalogued with meticulous care. Henning stayed in the doorway, staring into the dim interior. The image formed in his mind. Robert, here alone, pacing between the walls, not as a man seeking rescue, but as someone retreating deeper from the world. There were no bloodstains, no drag marks, no sign of an intruder. Just silence, artifacts, and a strange sense of suspension, as if time had been held here and then abandoned. Back at the station, Henning laid out the evidence in his mind. The second disposable camera, Ellen's journal entries, the buried notebook found behind the cabin, the ledger confirming Robert had returned the utility trailer after his family vanished. And now, this hidden shelter with Katie's belongings. But no trace of Jason, no sign of Ellen. The thought pressed in. What if they had never made it past the first cabin at all? What if only Robert reached this place? And why would he have brought his daughter's things here? That night, Henning drove to Lake Thornberry. The lake was still, glassy under the moonlight. He parked near the old trailhead and began walking along the ridge line where, in 1994, the Bennett family's truck should have passed. The air was sharp enough to sting his nose. He moved slowly, scanning the slope below for any splash of color or glint of metal. Search crews had covered this ground back then, but in those days there were no drones, no LiDAR sweeps, just boot prints in the mud and human eyes straining against the dark. 50 yards down a side slope, something caught. A shred of faded red cloth, tangled in the grip of exposed roots. Henning crouched, freed it gently. A scrap of heavy canvas, part of a seat cushion. Peering farther downslope, his breath caught. Wedged at the edge of a sheer drop was a sliver of rusted metal, the kind that doesn't occur naturally. The rest lay buried under a skin of earth and moss. He called it in immediately. The forensic team arrived the next morning with ground-penetrating radar. Within hours, they confirmed it. The Bennett's truck lay upside down beneath a decade of soil and debris, swallowed by a long-ago landslide. The recovery took 3 days. The vehicle's panels were flaked with rust, its frame warped, windows reduced to dust. Inside, 3 sets of skeletal remains were found, each secured in a seatbelt, each positioned forward as if still waiting for the road to continue. The dental records removed any doubt. Ellen, Jason, and Katie. Robert was not among them. The condition of the wreck was telling. The ignition was in the off position. The emergency brake had never been engaged. All 4 tires were intact. It didn't feel like an accident. It felt like someone had let the truck roll forward over the edge, coasting into silence. Henning stood at the top of the ridge, his boots inches from where the front wheels must have broken the lip. No guardrails, no warning signs. Just an open sky and loose gravel. Below him lay the wreckage, 3 lives erased in one quiet drop. And still, Robert's absence was the loudest thing in the scene. Nobody. No trace. Just the strange trail he had left behind. Buried journals, rolls of undeveloped film, and fleeting snapshots of someone unraveling in the hours before everything ended. The official report would record the cause of death for Ellen and the children as accidental vehicular trauma pending further review. But no one in the department said it out loud anymore. They all knew who had walked away. The only question left was where he had gone. Henning pulled the rental trailer ledger again, eyes locking on the line. Returned in person. The manager had been clear. Robert was alone, calm, wearing sunglasses, paying in cash. That was 3 full days after the family's disappearance was reported, meaning Robert had been somewhere alive after the crash, before making his quiet return. The image of the buried shelter came back to him, the sleeping bag, the stillness, the sense of a man hiding from the world. Had Robert planned it all from the start? Or had something broken inside him that weekend, setting events into motion that no one else could ever piece together? The notebook suggested a withdrawal, not rage. An absence in the eyes. A man still there in body, but fading from reach. The photographs showed him awake when everyone else slept, standing alone in the dark, gripping something no one could quite identify. Whatever had been in Robert's head during those last hours, he had kept it to himself. He never wrote it down, and he never came back. When the bodies were finally recovered, the news didn't blaze across the country. It was just a short segment on the local evening broadcast, 3 names, 3 faces, and the words, "finally found." After 10 years of unanswered questions, the Bennett family's fate finally broke into the evening news. The anchor's voice was steady, almost detached, as she reported that the remains of Ellen, Jason, and Katie had been discovered in a remote corner of wilderness outside Idaho Falls. There was no mention of Robert, no acknowledgement that the father was unaccounted for. His name never passed her lips. The photographs recovered from the cameras were sealed inside the case file. Ellen's notebooks remained locked in a drawer, accessible only by key. The official paperwork named no suspects, issued no warrants. It simply closed the loop on 3 lives, while 1 man remained missing, unspoken. A few weeks later, with winter settling in, Henning drove out to the ridge one final time. The trees stood skeletal against a silver sky. A thin wind scraped across the exposed rock, carrying with it the smell of frozen earth. He stood at the edge, looking down at the place where the truck had come to rest. In the stillness, Henning pictured Robert at the wheel. Not angry, not frantic, just steady. Ellen beside him, the children asleep in the back, and some quiet shift in his mind turning the world on its side. Not an accident, a choice. Henning placed a small bouquet on the ground. No speech, no prayer, just silence. Back at his desk, the file was marked closed, but Henning never moved it from his drawer. On quiet nights, he would pull out the last photo, the one with Robert standing in the cabin's darkened room. Some nights, the man in the picture looked lost. Other nights, resolved, but always silent. Because even with every piece of evidence, Robert Bennett had never been found. And maybe, Henning thought, he'd never wanted to be.